Elroy.
Oh.
Let me get the microphone.
Elroy.
Elroy. That is my favorite name for God. And coincidentally, Rachel, am I echoing too much? Okay. Coincidentally, Rachel texted me that name this morning, and I was like, that's my favorite name for God, but I didn't tell her I was going to talk about him tonight that way. But there was a time period in my life, not too long ago actually, within the past couple of years, that I just, during worship, when I was I speak in tongues a lot during worship. I close my eyes and I'll pay attention to what's around me. But there was a time period in my life where I said that name just over and over and over again during worship, every time I worshiped. Just Elroy, Elroy. And then I would say, in English, the God who sees me. Elroy, Elroy, the God who sees me. Because I was going through something that I felt like no one else could understand, and a burden that no one else could carry for me. And I knew that he saw me. I knew that he could carry that burden, and I knew he was the only one that could do it. And so, I don't know if it makes sense to you, but I didn't want to call him by any other name, because that was the name that was most precious to me at that point in my life. And I think we go through seasons where God becomes, sometimes he's our provider, and that's what he is most to us in that season. Sometimes he's Elroy, the God who sees us. He's different things to us. He's everything to us at all times, but sometimes he's different things to us the most, if that makes sense. So tonight I want to talk to you about how he's Elroy. He's the God who sees us. Because Rachel and I were talking about, what I would talk about tonight, and she said forgiveness, or even restoration or letting go. And I think you'll see how I wrap this around that, because in order to do those things, we have to know that we have a God who sees us, that knows where we're at and what we're going through, and that he's a lover of our souls. And because he sees us and knows us like no other, he forgives us completely, and he's the only one that's able to relieve us fully of our burdens and of our shame and of our guilt. He's the only one that makes us able to go on and to let go and to forgive ourselves. So I'm going to kind of go through three Bible passages, and I won't keep you too long, I promise. But I'm going to go through one in Genesis, and then one in Mark, and then one in John. So if we start in Genesis, it's the story of Hagar, and it's one of my favorite stories. But it starts in Genesis 16. Two women, Sarah and Hagar. Now Sarai, which is what she was called at this point, Abram's wife, had borne him no children, but she had an Egyptian maidservant named Hagar. So she said to Abram, "The Lord has kept me from having children. Go, sleep with my maidservant. Perhaps I can build a family through her." Abram agreed to what Sarai said. So after Abram had been living in Canaan 10 years, Sarai, his wife, took her Egyptian maidservant, Hagar, and gave her to her husband to be his wife. He slept with Hagar, and she conceived. When she knew she was pregnant, she began to despise her mistress. Then Sarai said to Abram, "You are responsible for the wrong I am suffering. I put my servant in your arms, and now that she knows she is pregnant, she despises me. May the Lord judge between you and me." "Your servant is in your hands," Abram said. "Do with her whatever you think best." Then Sarai mistreated Hagar, so she fled from her. The angel of the Lord found Hagar near a spring in the desert. It was the spring that is beside the road to Shur. And he said, "Hagar, servant of Sarai, where have you come from, and where are you going?" "I'm running away from my mistress Sarai," she answered. Then the angel of the Lord told her, "Go back to your mistress and submit to her." The angel added, "I will so increase your descendants that they will be too numerous to count." The angel of the Lord also said to her, "You are now with child, and you will have a son. You shall name him Ishmael, for the Lord has heard of your misery. He will be a wild donkey of a man. His hand will be against everyone, and everyone's hand against him, and he will live in hostility toward all his brothers." And then, I love this part. She gave this name to the Lord who spoke to her. "You are the God who sees me." For she said, "I have now seen the one who sees me." That is why the well was called Bir Lahai Roi. It is still there between Kadesh and Bered. So Hagar bore Abram a son, and Abram gave the name Ishmael to the son she had born. Abram was 86 years old when Hagar bore him Ishmael. So that's the first time we see her call God, the one that sees her. And then if we turn to Genesis 21, the birth of Isaac. Now the Lord was gracious to Sarah as he had said, and the Lord did for Sarah what he had promised. Sarah became pregnant and bore a son to Abraham in his old age, at the very time God had promised him. Abraham gave the name Isaac to the son Sarah bore him. When his son Isaac was 8 days old, Abraham circumcised him as God commanded him. Abraham was 100 years old when his son Isaac was born to him. Sarah said, God has brought me laughter, and everyone who hears about this will laugh with me. And she added, who would have said to Abraham that Sarah would nurse children? Yet I have borne him a son in his old age. The child grew and was weaned, and on the day Isaac was weaned, Abraham held a great feast. But Sarah saw that the son whom Hagar the Egyptian had borne to Abraham was mocking. And she said to Abraham, get rid of that slave woman and her son, for that slave woman's son will never share in the inheritance with my son Isaac. The matter distressed Abraham greatly because it concerned his son. But God said to him, do not be so distressed about the boy and your maidservant. Listen to whatever Sarah tells you, because it is through Isaac that your offspring will be reckoned. I will make the son of the maidservant into a nation also, because he is your offspring. Early the next morning, Abraham took some food and a skin of water and gave them to Hagar. He set them on her shoulders and then sent her off with the boy. She went on her way and wandered in the desert of Beersheba. When the water in the skin was gone, she put the boy under one of the bushes. Then she went off and sat down nearby, about a bow shot away, for she thought, I cannot watch the boy die. And as she sat there nearby, she began to sob. God heard the boy crying, and the angel of God called to Hagar from heaven and said to her, what is the matter, Hagar? Do not be afraid. God has heard the boy crying as he lies there. Lift the boy up and take him by the hand, for I will make him into a great nation. Then God opened her eyes, and she saw a well of water. So she went and filled the skin with water and gave the boy a drink. God was with the boy as he grew up. He lived in the desert and became an archer. While he was living in the desert of Bryanne, his mother was kind enough to get a wife for him from Egypt, which I'm sure he appreciated. But we all appreciate when people pick out our wives for us, or our husbands. But the part that I love is when when the angel asks her, where are you? Come back here. When the angel says, like the angel asks, what is the matter, Hagar? Do not be afraid. God has heard the boy crying as he lies there. He asks, but he doesn't even wait for an answer, because he already knows. He already knows why she's crying. Because God knew exactly where she was, knew exactly what was going on, knew the exact circumstances. So it was a rhetorical question. He wasn't really asking. He already knew. And then if you pay attention when you read and you listen carefully or watch carefully when you're reading, you see that God opened her eyes and she saw a well of water. The well of water was already there. The provision was already there. God didn't create the well of water. Her eyes were closed to what was already there, to what God already had planned for her, the provision that he already had, the escape he already had, the plan that he already had, because he already knew she was going to be there with her son. He already knew what they needed. He saw them right where they were. So I love that story. I absolutely love that story, and I have a soft spot for Hagar because I feel like she was a woman that was used and abused, and then thrown away. So I'm not saying she was perfect, because I know she, kind of taunted Sarah and stuff, but I have a soft spot for her because I feel like she was truly used and then cast aside. But we see where God saw her as worthy. He saw her as someone. He saw her as worth saving, and he saw her right where she was at every moment. And so I just, and she was the one that got to declare my favorite name of God. You know, she was the one that said, Elroy, the God who sees me. So I love that story. And then we come to Mark 5:21. When Jesus had again crossed over by boat to the other side of the lake, a large crowd gathered around him while he was by the lake. Then one of the synagogue rulers named Jairus came there. Seeing Jesus, he fell at his feet and pleaded earnestly with him, "My little daughter is dying. Please come and put your hands on her so she will be healed and live." So Jesus went with him. A large crowd followed and pressed around him, and a woman was there who had been subject to bleeding for 12 years. She had suffered a great deal under the care of many doctors and had spent all she had. Yet instead of getting better, she grew worse. When she heard about Jesus, she came up behind him in the crowd and touched his cloak, because she thought, "If I just touch his clothes, I will be healed." Immediately her bleeding stopped, and she felt in her body that she was freed from her suffering. At once Jesus realized that power had gone out from him. He turned around in the crowd and asked, "Who touched my clothes?" Again, a rhetorical question. He knew exactly who touched him. "You see the people crowding against you," his disciples answered, "and yet you can ask, 'Who touched me?'" But Jesus kept looking around to see who had done it. Then the woman, knowing what had happened to her, came and fell at his feet, trembling with fear, told him the whole truth, said, "I've been sick for 12 years. I'm the one that touched you," told him everything. He said to her, "Daughter, your faith has healed you. Go in peace and be free from your suffering." And again, there's something special about this story. This is the only story in the Bible where we see God address a woman as his daughter. You know, use that tender term. It's the only story where we see him say, "Daughter, go, you know, your faith has healed you." And again, he already knew exactly who touched him. He knew right where she was. He knew right what had happened. He knew right what she needed. Him asking her was for her sake and for the sake of the people around her, not because he didn't know who had touched him. But he used that tender term with her, daughter, you know. He knew right where she was. I want to read you a passage. I taught a book several years ago called What Women Fear by Angie Smith. And I can't recommend it enough. It's an awesome book. But I want to read you a short passage from it that kind of puts you into this story of the woman touching his garment. It says, "She walks through a crowd of people, eyes down and heart pounding. She doesn't want them to know. She is hiding something that could ruin her. And if she can figure out a way to just slip through the people and get to him, she may be healed. That's what she's after anyway, healing. She doesn't want to be noticed, to be called out, to be identified. She just wants to touch him from the shadows, all the while keeping her secret to herself. It was shameful, and she couldn't bear the thought of everyone knowing she wasn't what she seemed. She sees her chance, and immediately she moves toward him. Just a touch of his cloak, and it will all be over. No more shame, no more hiding, no more secrecy. The crowd was all around her, and she blended in with the throngs of people as they clamored to be near him. His hem, my freedom. I believe he can save me from this. In an instant, she reached out, felt the cloth in her hands, and was miraculously healed. She must have known it, but it wasn't exactly as she had planned. There, in the chaos of people, he stopped. I suspect she panicked as she considered what might happen next. "Who touched me?" he asked. I can imagine the way her blood must have run cold. She had been discovered. It hadn't happened the way she had pictured it. A stranger just reaching out anonymously and sneaking a blessing. He knew who had touched him, and he knew why. He asked because he wanted her to speak up and to identify herself in spite of her fear. He clearly wasn't trying to humiliate her, but I wonder if she felt like he was going to. As he waited for her response, the people began to murmur innocence. Not me, not me, not me. I wonder if she panicked. I wonder if she was too desperate to even care at that point. All eyes were on her, and she realized she was no longer hidden. She fell at his feet, shaking with fear as she identified herself. There was no point in keeping up the charade. She realized she was caught. Do you? And you have to remember, back then, it was a death sentence to even touch him. She was unclean, so she would have been killed just for touching him. She had just touched his robe, and the crowd was breathless with anticipation. The sheer nerve of this woman, thinking she deserved something from Jesus. Who was she anyway? Who touched him? He hardly let another moment pass before he blessed her with the words, "Daughter, your faith has made you well. Go in peace and be healed of your disease." He wasn't identifying her so that he could ridicule her or expose her shame. He was affirming her faith, because in that moment she believed him to be more powerful than the condition that had crippled her for over a decade of her life. She was a woman with nothing left to lose, and he recognized her faith in him. I imagine her weeping with relief, not just at her healing, but because she had felt something true rise up in her bones as he spoke. He knows who I am. We come with our infirmities and our feebleness, and we beg for him to heal us, but we fear his methods. We can't help but see ourselves as the exception to his mercy. Maybe he won't forgive me. Maybe my sin was too great. Maybe he doesn't even care. He'll just go on his way to more important things. I'm one in a crowd of millions. Who in the world do I think I am, calling out to the king? On a dusty road leading to Nazareth, Jesus' actions answer that question. You are the one I stopped for. You are the one I long to heal. I know your name. I know your heart. I know everything about you, including that we would meet here today. You are the one who sought me, and I delighted in knowing your hand would reach for my hem in faith. What you saw as an act of desperation, I saw as an act of love. How many never reach out to me at all because they don't think it would make a difference? Now go in peace and newness of life. Jesus makes it clear in this moment that she is not to be known as the woman with the issue of blood, but rather the woman who had faith in him. She will not be known for what she was, but by what she had in spite of it, faith. Regardless of the potential for shame or hurt, the woman with the issue of blood was willing to stay who she was in light of who she could be. Don't trade your legacy for your reputation. He is here and he is able. I don't want to miss that blessing either, despite how hard it is to acknowledge my shame and my weaknesses while the crowds look on. What matters in this moment is not their eyes, but his. Never mind them. Just remember that they are here to witness your faithfulness to him. They have no power over you. Go to the Lord and tell him your name. Tell him the depth of your brokenness and regret. And just as dawn breaks, you will know you have been healed by the man who gives you a new name. You will walk for the rest of your days telling the story of redemption, not in words or deeds, but in your very existence. Not she who would have existed if not for the night, but rather she who chased him in faith and refused to let him go. She who rejoices in the glorious limp that reminds her of the night made day and the name that God spoke to her. And I think really, I could stop there, but there's one more story that I love that I want to share with you. But that passage from that book to me just brings the story of the woman that had faith. And I'm going to try to stop calling her the woman that had the issue of blood and remember to call her the woman that had faith. I love that passage in that book, and to me that just brings that to a whole new, brings a whole new light to that. But once again, we see how God saw her. But John 8, this is why you have stones and rocks on your tables. If you'll just do me a favor and just kind of hold your rock or your stone while I'm talking to you about this. This story in John 8 is the only time that we see Jesus writing in the Bible. So let me read you the story first, and then I want to explain something to you. Jesus went to the Mount of Olives. At dawn, he appeared again in the temple courts, where all the people gathered around him, and he sat down to teach them. The teachers of the law and the Pharisees brought in a woman caught in adultery. They made her stand before the group and said to Jesus, "Teacher, this woman was caught in the act of adultery. In the law, Moses commanded us to stone such women. Now what do you say?" They were using this question as a trap in order to have a basis for accusing him. But Jesus bent down and started to write on the ground with his finger. When they kept on questioning him, he straightened up and said to them, if any one of you is without sin, let him be the first to throw a stone at her." Again, he stooped down and wrote on the ground. At this, those who heard began to go away one at a time, the older ones first, until only Jesus was left, with the woman still standing there. Jesus straightened up and asked her, "Woman, where are they?" Well, he didn't say it like that. He didn't say woman, but anyway. "Woman, where are they?" I got a little too carried away there. Like, I'm sure it was a little bit nicer than that. "Woman, where are they? Has no one condemned you?" "No one, sir," he said. "Then neither do I condemn you," Jesus declared. "Go now and leave your life of sin." So, I looked up some new details about stoning when I was reading the story because I really wanted to put myself in the story, and I really wanted to know exactly what a stoning was like. And then I talked to Pastor, and then I kind of like disagreed with him for a minute, and then I'm like, well, this is what it says, and then he's like, well, I don't care what it says because it's wrong. So anyway, because he brought out the point that this was more of like a spontaneous stoning. So I guess there were planned stonings, there were planned, and then there were spontaneous. So, but when I looked up stonings, it's a really barbaric, practice. But it still happens today sometimes. But a lot of times the planned stonings, like when there would be, witnesses and the judge or whatever, they would take the person and they would have a bed of rocks, huge stones, huge rocks. They would take the person to a height that was twice their height, and they would throw them down. They would take them by the hips and they would throw them face down, which they say heart first because, that is the symbolism, like they're throwing their heart on the rocks, but, face down onto the rocks. And sometimes that alone would kill them. So they would turn them over to check if they were dead, and then if they weren't, then they would take a huge, boulder or stone and throw it onto their chest. And then if they were still alive, then everybody would just pick up stones and rocks and start pelting them, until the person died. Another way that stoning happens, the pastor told me that I also saw when I looked up is, they bury a person, waist deep, and a woman, they would bury her to about here, and then they stone them. Another way is, they throw them off of a high place so that they are so injured that they can't run away, and then they start, stoning them. So there's all different ways. This would have been more of a kind of spontaneous stoning like Stephen, who was martyred for Christ, the first martyr for Christ. And that is basically just people picking up huge stones and rocks and just, pelting the person until they died. The average stoning took anywhere from 20 minutes to 2 hours is how long the person suffered. But it is a truly barbaric practice. And then also, technically, if adultery had occurred, a man and a woman were supposed to be punished. But as we see in this story, only the woman was there. And that pastor said because it was very hard to prove that a man committed adultery because of all the things that they were allowed to do. So it was hard to prove that they were actually doing something they weren't allowed to do. So there was a lot of double standards, I guess, going on. But if you can just imagine in your mind, it's a very barbaric scene. It's not, I think maybe in the past I've just kind of thought of, like everybody's calmly, sitting there and, getting ready to stone her. No, I think it would have been more of a heartbreaking, tragic scene where people would have been calling out things to her. I think they would have been calling out, probably harassing comments to her. And so this is what I want you to think about. Sorry, you get to hear me taking caps off markers really loudly.
Yeah, we can.
Never knew it was that loud, did you? But this is what I would like you to think about. When we do things, and when people do things to us, how we look at, how we look at ourselves and how we look at ourselves or how we look at somebody when they've done something compared to how God looks at us. Because if you look here, it's the only time in the Bible that Jesus is seen writing. So Pastor and I were talking about, I've had different theories over the years about, what I think he was writing. And we might be surprised. We might get to heaven one day and Jesus was like, well, I was playing tic-tac-toe, to pass the time. I already knew the answer to the test. I mean, that would be kind of funny. But, really, we have no idea what he was writing. But Pastor said a lot of people believe, and it makes a lot of sense, that he was writing the sins of the people that were standing around judging. Mm-hmm. Because he says, if you look, he starts to write before he ever responds to them. But Jesus bent down and started to write on the ground with his finger as soon as they asked him. He starts to write. Then when they kept on questioning him, he straightened up and said to them, if any one of you is without sin, let him be the first to throw a stone at her. Then he stooped down and started writing again. So it does make a lot of sense that maybe he was writing the sins of the people around him. Like, do you remember this? Do you remember this? And he may have even been writing the names of the people and what they were doing. Like, do you know where your wife is right now? Do you know where? It's possible that he was, calling people out, And it started with the oldest. The oldest left first and then went from there. So it kind of makes you think maybe they had more sins because they were older and they had, done more things. But, we don't know what he was writing. But I just want you to kind of use your imagination and say, what if he was writing, what if they were calling out things to her, ugly, hateful things, and what if he was writing his response to those things, okay? So, what if they were calling out dirty and he was writing clean? And what if they were calling out sinner and he was writing my daughter?
Uh-huh.
What if they were calling out condemned and he was writing forgiven? What if they were calling out hated and he was writing loved? This is the way that Jesus sees us. No matter what we've done. We have to start seeing ourselves like this. Mm-hmm. And we have to start seeing other people like this and not like this. Mm-hmm. I looked and I looked and I looked in the Bible for verses about forgiving yourself, and there aren't any. There are not verses about forgiving yourself that I could find. And I did some research and I couldn't find anything about forgiving yourself. And if you think about it, it makes perfect sense. Because God is the only one. Like we need forgiveness horizontally from people that we've hurt. But first we need it vertically from God. But there's no verses about, forgiving yourself. And if you think about it, if God's forgiven us, but we don't forgive ourselves, we're making ourselves higher than God. We're actually we're turning ourselves into, God says, have no other gods before me. Well, if we're saying, okay, God, like I accept the fact that you can forgive me, but I can't forgive myself. Well, now we just said that the King of the world, who sent his son to die on the cross for us and went through all that suffering, now we're saying we'll take his forgiveness. It's good enough to take his forgiveness. And he can die on the cross. And he can do everything that he did. But we can't forgive ourselves. It's like we're making ourselves an idol of God. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
And I think that's why there aren't verses in the Bible about forgiving yourself. Because who are we in comparison to God? We need forgiveness from each other when we wrong somebody, and we need forgiveness from him. We need that first, and that will enable us to forgive each other. Because if you don't have a relationship with God, it's really hard to do those hard things, And, I always, try to encourage people, do the hard things. Do the hard things. But you can't do the hard things if you can't do that thing, But I would just encourage you to, this is how God sees you. And who are we to see ourselves any differently? So as we go into the new year, let go of the rocks towards other people, that you want to throw. And let go of them towards yourself, too. And because sometimes that's way harder. Like, sometimes it's so much easier to forgive somebody else, but we can't forgive ourselves. But I think we need to think, okay, if God can forgive me, then who am I to not forgive myself? So I wanted you to just bear with me. I'm really big on symbolism, or just something to keep it in your mind. I don't know how you would want to phrase it, but I want you to close your eyes and just trust me. I'm going to come around with some red paint, and I promise I'm just going to dab your hand with it, the back of your hand with it. But I just want you to leave here just with a little reminder that this is how God sees you. So I just want to dab your hand with red paint to remind you of the blood of Christ, that you're covered by that. So if you'll allow me to do that, I would love to do that. And while I'm doing that, Rachel, I know I didn't ask you ahead of time, but if you don't mind just praying over the women for the new year, and if you don't mind just praying for them by name, just going and praying for them by name.